flexibility in the way they kind of think about things. That's also really exacerbated when they're in a scary situation. So trying to keep things as kind of flexible as possible, because the last thing you want is a child you know, who really, really hates the sense of having a shower, but they're kind of giving it a go. They're trying to have more showers in the morning. But if it's things like, I will have a shower each morning, if they're like, oh my goodness, this morning, I just cannot face it, I can't do it, that's it. Like the world has imploded potentially. Whereas if it's, I will try, and here's an option if I don't, it means that everything's a lot more flexible and that it doesn't feel so much like kind of failing and that it's a big catastrophe. So can you spot the positive coaching sentences here? So these are all coaching sentences, but some of them are less positive than others. So I will try to listen to the speaker. I will stop annoying the speaker. If I don't hear something, I will ask the speaker to repeat. I will stop picking my nose. I will stop being silly. I will try to make notes on the presentation. So anyone got any suggestions for which ones are positive or which ones are not positive?
First one's positive, and then the third one, and then the last one.
Yeah, absolutely. So these things like, I will try, if this happens, I could do this instead. But then things like, I will stop annoying people, I will stop picking my nose, I will stop being silly. Yeah, obviously I have the I will, so there's no flexibility in there. And also they're quite emotive as well. Like I will stop, it's basically saying you're being annoying and you're annoying other people. And then things like picking my nose, being silly, they're a bit shaming as well. So it's best not to. Rather than I will stop picking my nose, it could be things like I will use my fidget toy, and if my nose is itchy, I can ask to blow my nose, those sorts of things. Okay, so yeah, yeah, the positive ones were I've tried to listen to the speaker, try to make notes on the presentation, and I've forgotten to highlight if I don't hear something and kind of what the options are. Okay, so we can also offer choices as well. This is quite a nice one in terms of keeping some boundaries, but keeping it also flexible so it's kind of emotionally safe. If I want to get up, I have two choices. I can get up quietly and stand at the back of the classroom, or I can wait for the next break and stand up then. And obviously these are all individual to the child. So if you've got a child who really needs to stand up and flap kind of every 10 minutes, you wouldn't say to them, you have to wait till break or stand up quietly. You would do something like, I will remember, I'll sit on my spot on the side of the carpet so I can stand up and flap, but my friends can still see the teacher, for example. So it's always different for every single child. It's quite important to state that social stories are also not templates. A social story should always be bespoke to that child and that situation. Obviously, I'll put lots of examples in I still haven't got around to the communication folder. I had a really, really busy week last week, but I will put some kind of examples. But the idea is to use those as templates rather than kind of use them verbatim. Are you okay? Yes, carry on. That's fine.
Do need to use a socket. The one that's always not going into.
Okay, so that was choices. And then also just thinking about emotional safety, as we've talked about. So things like don't use language that assigns blame to a young person, and don't kind of suggest that their behaviour upsets other people. So, for example, my teacher will be happy if I stay sat on the floor. My mum will be upset if she hears about how naughty I have been. So all those sorts of kind of, old-fashioned techniques for kind of blaming children or shaming them into compliance, that's very much not the ethos of a social story. So kind of suggesting how they're so even if it's, if I do this, my teacher will be really happy, you're kind of implying, and if you don't, they will be unhappy. So kind of implying how their behavior affects other people's emotions it's one to be careful with. But you can also have things like, for example, if they are behaving inappropriately to their friends, and we'll come on to this when we look at comic strip conversations as well. You can kind of say things like, in this situation, this person was nervous, and actually this person felt a little bit upset about what you said. And when it's explaining that kind of context, but it shouldn't be used for this kind of, shaming children into a certain behaviour. So this is to just summarise social stories. I have written a social story if it has a positive tone, there's a ratio of at least 2 descriptive sentences to coaching sentences. And I would say really it should be something more like the ratio of 5 to 1. You want most of it to be descriptive and teaching, and then a very small amount of it to be kind of more directive. So the social story should use concrete, clear language. It should be accessible information. So trying to use according to the child's kind of comprehension and cognitive levels. It should have kind of symbols, photos, anything that works for them. And it should be emotionally safe. It shouldn't be something that kind of assigns blame or makes them feel upset. So I've not written a social story if it's just a list of rules. If I could make the child or young person feel blamed or guilty. And it's also not a social story if it's beyond the child or young person's level of comprehension. I would also say as well, I'm going to amend this, if it's a generic template, because that is not a social story. Okay, so can you tell me, is this a social story? Sometimes you take your clothes off. It is inappropriate not to wear clothes. It will make people feel uncomfortable and embarrassed if you don't. You must remember to keep your clothes on more. Sally will keep her clothes on from now on. Okay, so what do people think about that? I think, Wendy, did you put your hand up?
I know, it was just the sentence you said before you started this about it having to be a template, because you can get books written with social stories, can't you? So would they really be social stories then? Because they're not templates to the child, aren't they? Not written for the child.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there's lots of kind of the Carol Gray's books which have kind of social story templates in, but yeah, they do make me feel a little bit uneasy. So I think the idea is she's assuming that people have gone on her training, for example, and kind of have a really in-depth knowledge and know how to apply those templates, because yeah, they make yeah, to me they make me feel a little bit uncomfortable because it kind of looks like you can just pluck them off the shelf, whereas that's not really the case. So I would always, so you can use templates as in to give you an idea, to kind of remind you kind of how the coaching descriptive sentences work. But I generally wouldn't use just an unchanged template for a young person. It should always be bespoke to them and to their specific situation.
Thank you.
That makes sense. So yeah, so does anyone have any comments on this social story? I think I've forgotten as well just to mention that the idea is that we should use kind of third person pronouns, so it should be as undirective as possible, which kind of, and I'll go through that in more detail later, but that might also give you a clue about this social story. So does anyone have any comments on this social story?
I think it's very negative.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
sorry,
it's sort of blaming, isn't it? Yeah, I was going to say the same. Sort of, it looks like it's sort of blaming her. Like, you will make people feel uncomfortable and embarrassed.
Absolutely. So yeah, so it's negative. It kind of assigns blame. It's kind of assigns your behaviour affects other people negatively, that kind of thing. And also, so also it uses it uses second person, so it's you, which you're supposed to avoid in social stories because that's very, very directive. It should be things like, you know, Sally does this, sometimes we do this, rather than you do this or I feel like this. And also it's very vague. I'm not really sure what the young person is supposed to do. I just feel like this young person will go away with a vague sense of, I think I do bad things sometimes and I upset people, and I've got to try not to do that, but I don't really understand when, where and how I'm supposed to do that. So it's like, sometimes you take your clothes off. It's not you take your clothes off when you get upset at school, or you take your clothes off when you're overwhelmed, when you're shopping. And then you must remember to keep your clothes on more. You know, that's really, really vague. So it's like, oh, well, what about when I'm getting changed in the evening? What about when I have a shower? What about when I need to put my school uniform on? So yeah, so this is potentially quite a dangerous social story because it's really vague. So it doesn't give any specifics, and it's quite blaming, and it's very directive as well to the young person. So what about this one? Is this a social story? Obviously, this would have more symbols on if I'd had more time. People wear clothes. People wear clothes to keep warm and to cover up their bodies. Sometimes clothes are hot or itchy. When I go out of the house, I will try to keep my clothes on. If I want to take my clothes off when I'm out of the house, I can ask to go home. So what do people think about that one?
It's much more positive, and it's very specific about when and where, and it's much more helpful in that way.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Offering them a choice as well. It's saying, if I want to take my clothes off, I can ask to go home. So it's giving them an option.
Definitely. So it's kind of it's also accepting, yeah, that clothes are uncomfortable sometimes for that person, and here's something that you can do. Absolutely. So and the pronouns are kind of generally people do this and I will try, which is the best way to do it. And yeah, it's got lots of descriptive sentences and just one coaching sentence at the end. Brilliant. Oh, I've just seen, I will try to keep my cloths on. Dear me, sorry. I will go back through this and amend some of the typos. So I'm going to give you all 5 minutes now to choose a scenario and write your own social story. So if you can either choose from one of these scenarios, or you can think about maybe a young person on your caseload, or just if something occurs to you for one that you can write. So you can either do one for a child or young person who wants to take their seatbelt off in the car, a child or young person who kisses their peers and upsets them, a child or young person who is nervous about having their COVID vaccine. So if everyone has 5 minutes to have a go at writing their social story, and then at the end of 5 minutes we'll see if anyone's brave enough to share. So just remember the kind of the pronoun show, so it should be either general people or we or I, so it should never be you. You want to have kind of up to at least twice the amount or up to 5 times the amount of description sentences as opposed to coaching sentences. The social story should be specific to that person and to that situation. The coaching sentences should be flexible and kind of emotionally safe, potentially offering choices. And yeah, kind of the whole thing should be kind of as flexible as possible. So, okay, so I'm going to give you all 5 minutes until 9:37 exactly. Okay, everyone. So I hope everyone's had some time to write down some notes for a social story. Is there anyone who'd be willing to share their social story that they've written? I know this is putting you all on the spot. Sonia, you put your hand up.
I'm gonna have a go, but I'm not
Oh,
sure.
thank you. Very brave.
Not sure if it's gonna be right. Okay, so I looked at the seatbelt one.
Brilliant.
Okay, so everyone wears a seatbelt in the car. Seatbelts keep us safe. Sometimes they can feel tight and dig into our necks. If I need to take my belt off, I will ask for the car to stop. And then that's where I got to.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. That's fantastic. So kind of the pronouns used were I, so that's nice and personal to the child, and it also feels less directive than using you. You've got a really good ratio of your directive sentences to your coaching sentences. So I think you've got at least 3 descriptive sentences to coaching sentences. So everyone wears a seatbelt, they're there to keep us safe. Sometimes they can feel a bit tight. If it's bothering me, I can ask, and that's really nice. So, and also the language is really flexible. So if and I can ask, it's not kind of I ought to or I must, which is really nice. It's also really specific to the person and the situation. We know exactly, I feel like the young person knows exactly what to do in that situation. It's not just I must try to stop misbehaving. It's I know that if it's understandable that it's uncomfortable for me, and if it is uncomfortable, then there's something I can do and I can ask. Fantastic. And also it's emotionally safe as well. There were no kind of when I take my seatbelt off, it's really annoying for the driver or anything like that. So that was brilliant. Thank you, Sonia. That was very brave of you. Great. Is there anyone else who's got one or who would like to ask any questions?
We were just sharing just before the you came back on screen, and we'd all done the seatbelt one as well.
Great. Fantastic. Is there anyone who had any kind of questions as you were writing them? Was it tricky at all, or are you all super skilled at it already? Cool, that's fine. Rightio. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen again. See how this goes. Okay, can everyone see the slides now? Oh, I can't hear any yeses. Can everyone see how to implement a social story on the screen?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Brilliant. Okay, so now we've written our social story. Think about how we implement it or how we use it with the young person. And again, dangers of social stories are that they could be used as punishments or as things to tell children or young people off with. So the idea is that they should be presented at a neutral time. It should be, ideally, it's something that the child or young person should take ownership of. You know, it's a story about them. It's something about their life. You know, it's really exciting. If you can kind of, you know, have pictures of them in it, or maybe they could have their own book with their social stories in, and then it should be kind of neutral and positive, that it would be, you know, something that you'd read alongside bedtime stories or as a kind of a really nice kind of activity between them and their parent carer or their teacher. So it should be presented at a neutral time. It should not be read to them as a consequence. So say the child who really struggles not to stand up and flap has forgotten to sit on their spot. They got overexcited. They sat in the middle of the carpet and they stood up and they flapped everywhere, and their friends all got annoyed and they couldn't see the teacher. The teacher had to sort out the situation. It shouldn't be sit over there and read your social story, or let's look at your social story. You have to sit on the carpet. You have to do this. In that situation, that kind of situation should be dealt with, and then later on at a more neutral, positive, regulated time, that's when the social story can come out again. And ideally the social story is already a part of the child's life, so it's not something that comes out at highly emotive times. It's something that's just part of their life that they read on a regular basis. Yes, so the idea is the child young person should take ownership of it. It should be theirs. They should be proud of it. They should be it should be something they're happy to sit and read, and they should read it through in different situations with different people, ideally. So for example, their teacher should be reading it through with them, and their parent at home, and maybe when they go to, you know, grandma and grandpa's house, that sort of thing. So yeah, when I spoke last week about visuals, obviously widget symbols are really good to use, and hopefully we're all going to try and pilfer as many licenses as possible from IT. There's also the noun project, which has those more kind of slick, grown-up looking symbols, and there's also Easy on the Eye as well, which has absolutely loads of symbols and they're targeted for adults with learning disability, basically, but they're really nice and they're free. So now I'm going to talk about comic strip conversations really quickly. So again, they should be referenced Carol Gray 1991. She's the one who's kind of trademarked them. And the idea of comic strip conversations is very similar to social stories. It can help reflect on a situation, but it kind of goes into a bit more detail in terms of understanding other people's thoughts and motives. So specifically for children whose learning disability, communication difficulty or autism means that they struggle to kind of read between the lines and really work out what's going on, what someone else might be thinking. These are really quite useful, and they're really good for kind of just reflecting on a situation that maybe went a bit awry, or the young person is really struggling to work out why did that person get upset, or why did that end up the way that it did. So the idea is that you use stick figures, speech bubbles and thought bubbles, and the overall idea of them is that they're supposed to be really easy to draw. So if you read kind of Carol Gray's description of them, it gets a bit complicated. So you've got very specific speech and thought bubbles for different things. So everyone speaking at once should have little, you know, dips into for everyone. Everyone listening, it should have an arrow into their ear. People interrupting, it should be overlapping. Loud words big, quiet words small. Yeah, but I would say don't panic too much about remembering all those different rules. And she also has a list of different kind of colour codes for types of yeah, kind of vocabulary and kind of the way that people might be talking. And again, I would say don't worry too much about kind of memorising all the colours and things. If you are able to use colours, that's great. I'd maybe say use more of the zones of regulation colours because they're quite nice and they're quite evidence-based. But there are, just so you know, there are particular kind of rules to the shapes and the colours that you do use. So here's an example, and I'm sorry that it's not very good resolution. So you've got your kind of comic strip and you've got the place stated, so school. So you've got the I think this is the protagonist, you've got the man here, and he is thinking, I really like Jane, I want her to go to the cinema with me. So that's what he's thinking. And then what he's saying is, hi, I know you, you're Jane, I'm Tim. And she says, yes, I'm Jane. But in her head, she's thinking, I don't know Tim and I feel worried. The next thing that happens is Tim is thinking, oh, I'm really nervous. So it's kind of explaining like, oh, Tim, you were feeling nervous. And you said, will you go to the cinema with me? And Jane said, when? And actually, Jane was also feeling really worried. Help, he's asked this very suddenly. I don't know him. So I'm assuming this is a situation, maybe kind of teenagers in a high school, where Jane has maybe got upset or got very, very worried about this. And Tim has got kind of also really upset about, you know, why did she run away and cry, or why did she not turn up at the cinema or something like that. And this would be a really good way of explaining to Tim, you know, this is what you were thinking, but actually this is what Jane was thinking because you don't know her very well. You were feeling nervous, she was feeling worried. That probably contributed to her, you know, running away and crying and you getting upset, for example. So it's just a really, really good reflective tool. And again, it needs to try and be as emotionally safe as possible and just stick to really factual things. So rather than like, I think you were really weird to ask her and I think she probably thinks you're a freak, it should be things like, oh, you thought that she looked really nice, however she was thinking, I don't know Tim very well. So it's kind of suggesting that, you know, it's not that you won't be friends in the future, it's just in that situation, this was the thing that didn't quite gel, this is what was being said, this is what was being thought, for example. So that was a really, really quick overview of comic strip conversations. I'll send some more I can send some more resources and things out for them, and there's lots of Carol Gray resources, but it's generally quite a simple idea, and as long as you kind of have the rules of the kind of emotional safety and the not assigning blame that we've already talked about in social stories, comic strip conversations shouldn't be too difficult, and they're just a really good reflective tool. So this is a really, really lovely quote from Carol Gray's website. Oh, she's a real sort of like cheesy American hippie. She's really nice. So to write a social story is to assume an invitation into the mind of a child, adolescent or adult with autism. Let's be careful in there. So I just think that's really, really sweet. That's a really nice example. So I'll just quickly go through some resources that I have that I will send around or that are available. So I'll come on to that one in a second. So there's a nice Autism West Midlands description of social stories, and again, so it's got a kind of an example here of describing why we need to keep clean, and it's really nicely symbolized, it's really kind of descriptive. So yeah, that's a nice example of one. Again, it's not one that we would just print and give to someone straight away, but we'd kind of, it's a nice one to kind of base our own social stories on. So there's one about anger, yeah, and one about kind of keeping clean. This is, I think this is from some training that Carol Gray did, and I tried to really, really simplify it down, but I still think it's maybe a bit complicated, but I will send this out. And then this was another another kind of handout that I wrote from some of her training. But again, I'm actually good after this, I'm just going to write a really, really simple guide with literally just sort of bullet points, so that you can just have a quick reference guide. So these are from this is her website, Carol Gray Social Stories. So there's lots of things like, you know, the philosophy of it. What is a social story? You can kind of read lots of examples of social stories and things like that. Because she's American, lots of her stories are very American, you know, about like moving grade, or, you know, there's things like going into storm shelters when it's hurricane season and things like that. When you look through the examples on her website, there's not a huge amount that are that relevant to English cohort of children, but they're useful to look at. And just so you know, that's her website. It's fairly snazzy. So she's actually done, which is really, really lovely, a load of social stories for children with learning disability and autism in Ukraine. And these make me feel a little bit sad, but they're really, really good social stories. So there's one here about staying together when you're in queues and crowds. So, you know, there's description of my family is travelling to a safer place. Sometimes we'll be in a queue. Queues happen a lot when people travel. You know, the people in this picture are standing in a queue. There might be nice people who help us. You know, we queue for lots of different things. Sometimes it's to get food, sometimes it's to get on a train. When there's lots and lots of people, queues can look like crowds. Crowds can be very noisy. There can be people shouting, children, there can be people talking or not talking. And then it's things like, so I think the only coaching sentence is it's important to stay close. I can hear people's voices, they'll be able to hear me. I can hold their hand, they can hold my hand, traveling to a safer place. Oh, it's going to make me cry. It's really, really emotional. Yeah, so there's some really, really lovely ones, and they're all really good examples. There's some quite interesting ones about what autism means and what it doesn't mean that are really nice, and they're really emotionally safe. And also there's lots about kind of people being different, which I think are a little bit abstract to the ones on her website, but again, you can use them for kind of different cognitive levels. And this is a really nice one about, so this, for example, this would be for a young child who just has quite general anxiety about kind of being unsafe. And this one, it just talks about wherever I go, there are things to help children stay safe. So there's people to help me, there's physical things, there's safety equipment. Ooh. There's signs, there's laws, there's rules, and at the end I think it has wherever I go there's one more person to keep me safe. That person is me, which is very nice. So yeah, there's all sorts of different examples on Carol Gray's website, and they do get quite kind of creative, which is quite nice. I did also find there's really, really sweet YouTube channel. I think it's only got sort of 4 social stories on, oh no, 3 social stories. And again, I just thought these were really good, actually. So there's one about, I won't play the whole thing to you, but it's a little boy who's kind of getting his hair cut, and it just sort of goes through, you know, if I have to wait, I can sit down and read my book. And it's very sweet. He calls the hairdresser the stylist. He talks about kind of you put a little cape on, and what it will feel like. So she might touch my hair, she'll spray my hair, might use these are different bits of equipment she might use. I'll be able to feel the spray on my hair and my neck. She will touch my hair, I'll feel the comb, I might feel the scissors, I might hear the buzzer. And then it's something like, at the end, I look awesome, or something. And that's really sweet. And again, I wouldn't necessarily say just always give out just the same old video for haircuts. But if you have a child who potentially kind of that you know well, and you think actually they wouldn't be too rigid about this. So for example, a child who had very rigid thinking would be like, but that's not what my hairdresser looks like, and I don't sit on a block, and my cape is, you know, orange that I put on, and I've got ginger hair, not blonde hair, all those sorts of things. But if you had a young person who you felt could deal with that flexibility, and it's just a general guide, obviously you could use those as well, which is I thought it was really nice. Brilliant. So
Naomi,
hello.
Please just put a question into the chat. Are the Ukraine social stories could be used with refugees and asylum seekers generally?
Yeah, absolutely. There's loads of them on the website, so they're really nice to look through. And again, a social story should always be, particularly when you're working with children, you know, who've experienced kind of trauma and things like that. It should always be personalised and bespoke, but they're really nice kind of guides for how to how to look at kind of really difficult situations like that, and things that we might not really think of. And also what I like about hers is they're pictures of Ukrainian people, so it would feel very very familiar to the child or young person. Yeah, so they're really nice for thinking of examples. I think a lot of the examples on Carol Gray's website are more leaning towards autism rather than learning disability. So just in terms of particularly people from the learning disability team, some of them might be a bit too wordy, really. So again, it's always bespoke to the young person and their learning and comprehension levels. But yeah, definitely. So the last thing was just, does anyone have any further questions? I'm going to stop recording now if anyone wants to talk about anything more specific.